Welcome to Sty Stories, the podcast that will elevate your English skills from okay to good, and from good to great. Today's episode diverges from our usual content. Instead, I'll be delving into my process for crafting an episode of Sty Stories. A process, simply put, is the method by which something is accomplished. I'll be sharing how I create each podcast episode and offering insights into effective language learning strategies. Why this topic? Well, I've spent considerable time pondering the theoretical underpinnings of this podcast, yet I've neglected to share this with you, our listeners. I hope that by the end of this episode, you will have a clearer understanding of language learning methodologies and, if you happen to be a language educator, insights into how to enhance your teaching approach. Around the time I started the podcast, I was reading a lot of research on second language acquisition. A second language is one that you learn after your first language or native language. So my first language is Hindi and my second language is English. Technically, you can have a third, fourth, fifth, and so on. But we commonly use the term second language to refer to any language learned after your first. Acquisition means acquiring and getting something. In this context, it means learning. So, second language acquisition is the study of how we learn languages. You might wonder why I use the word acquisition instead of just saying learning a second language. Well, it's because learning a language is a bit different from learning other things. When we talk about learning, we often think of studying hard, reading books, and trying to remember facts. Remembering facts is what we call memorization. For example, in the past, people had to memorize poems so they could recite them without looking at the words. But learning a language doesn't work quite the same way. You can't just memorize all the parts of a language like you would memorize a poem. That's because the ability to pick up a language is something we're born with. When we say something is innate, it means we have it naturally from the time we're born. We might not be born already speaking a language, but every single person is born with the ability to learn one. It's like our brains are wired to soak up language from the world around us, so we know that language acquisition is an innate process. We listen to the language around us, people communicate with us, and so we acquire our first language. How we acquire our first language hasn't changed much in human history because it works. What doesn't work so well is language teaching, at least for most people. Consider your language classes in school. How many students became fluent in the language after years of lessons? And how many students kept learning after they left school? The truth is that the majority of language teaching hasn't changed much since ancient Roman times. For thousands of years, the approach has been the same. Learn a set of grammar rules. Memorize vocabulary. And then, voila! You're supposed to be speaking the language. But let's face it, that's not how it usually turns out, is it? Now, some of you might have enjoyed this traditional method of teaching. There are folks out there with brains that just seem to grasp grammar effortlessly. I'm one of those annoying people, I'll admit. But for many of us, we spent years studying English in school without ever feeling truly confident speaking it. In the 1970s, a linguist called Stephen Krashen had a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an idea in science that someone is trying to prove. For example, there is a famous story about Isaac Newton. An apple fell on Isaac Newton's head, and that inspired him to create a hypothesis. He hypothesized that things are pulled towards the earth, the ground. This hypothesis became the theory of gravity. Stephen Krashen's hypothesis was this: We learn languages by communicating and understanding messages. He called this the theory of comprehensible input. Comprehensible means easy to understand, and input is information that you put into something. For example, when you press a button on your computer, that is input. It tells the computer to do something. When I speak into the microphone, that is also input. The microphone uses sound as input and records it. Stephen Krashen believed that language acquisition occurs through comprehensible input, which means receiving information through reading and listening that is easy to understand. Essentially, we learn a language when we encounter speech, books, or podcasts that we can comprehend. Krashen shared an anecdote that influenced his theory during one of his talks. While working as the director of English as a second language at a university in New York during the 1970s, he had neighbors who had recently moved from Japan. Naturally, he attempted to teach English to one of their children, a 4-year-old girl named Hitomi. How did Krashen attempt to teach Hitomi? He started by encouraging her to practice speaking. Initially, he provided her with phrases to repeat, such as, "Do you like that ball?" However, she remained silent. Then he tried giving her words to say, starting with ball, say ball. Yet, she still didn't respond. So he proceeded to break down the word into its component sounds, saying bo, lu, ball. Despite this, Hitomi remained silent. He tried making a deal with her, making an agreement with her, saying things like, "I won't give you the ball until you say the word ball." By now, you can probably guess that this didn't work. Then, 5 months later, Hitomi started to speak. By the end of the year, Hitomi could speak almost as well as the other kids her age in the neighborhood. So what happened? Hitomi didn't appear to be learning during her 5-month silence, but she was. She was listening. She was understanding things in context. She was learning language through comprehensible input. You may be thinking, "Hey, I spend a lot of time watching English TV shows, and it's taken me much longer than 5 months to be able to speak." Consider this. During Hitomi's 5 months in New York, she was constantly exposed to English. Because she was a child, people would try to make things simple for her to understand. For those 5 months, that silent period, Hitomi wasn't speaking, but she was acquiring. And importantly, she was communicating. When people talked to her in English, she didn't just stand there and do nothing. She told people when she understood and when she didn't, and she could answer simple questions the same way we all do as children. By making facial expressions, like smiling or looking confused, and using body language. When she was ready, she spoke, and her speaking improved very quickly. Since Krashen published his theory in the 1970s, many other researchers have criticized him. Researchers are scientists who do research, who create and test new hypotheses. In science, researchers often criticize each other. They say that someone else's theory is wrong, that the answer is different. And many researchers in second language acquisition have criticized Krashen's idea of comprehensible input. However, almost all second language acquisition researchers agree with Krashen. Often, they call comprehensible input something different, or they consider it part of a wider idea. For example, implicit versus explicit learning. And there is a lot of research that supports Krashen's theory. In 2021, 2 researchers, Karen Lickman and Bill Van Patten, said that comprehensible input is not a hypothesis. It is a fact, and I agree. While teaching, I've seen so many students who hate learning languages, who find it scary, who have spent years studying vocabulary lists but still feel uncomfortable speaking to a native speaker. On the other hand, when I taught them using comprehensible input, stories, games, conversations, and so on, they started to change. They grew more confident, and they began to use the language without thinking about it. So when I started my channel, I followed Krashen's theory. As I previously stated, other researchers have contributed to Krashen's work, and significant research on second language acquisition has occurred since the 1970s. However, Krashen's theory is an excellent introduction to the subject, and I believe it is the clearest way to discuss these concepts. If I were teaching this as a university course, I would include more information about other researchers, but this is only an introduction to the topic. If you're interested and want to know more, today's episode is quite scientific. So if you are finding it hard to follow, make sure to take lots of breaks. In fact, why not take a break now? Go get a cup of tea, go to the toilet, or get some food. I'll see you in a bit. So the theory of comprehensible input is made up of 5 hypotheses. I'm going to explain each of the 5 hypotheses. Then I'll tell you how they helped me design Sty Stories. The first hypothesis is the input hypothesis. The input hypothesis states that people learn language when they understand input that is slightly above their current level, their level right now. You might remember in a previous episode I did, Why Reading is Must, I talked about reading books where you understand 98% of the words on the page. This is an example of the input hypothesis used practically. We learn best when we understand almost all of the text or audio, but there is a small new part. Often, we can figure out what the new thing means because of the context around it. The input hypothesis is often written as I plus 1. This is a mathematical way of understanding it. 1 I means interlanguage, the form of language that the learner has acquired so far, and plus 1 is the new information that is being added. If you add too many new elements, for example, if you read a book where you only understand 50% of the words on the page, you will get tired and confused. So it's I plus 1 and not I plus 20. Many researchers criticized this hypothesis and said that this was unclear. What is I and what is 1? However, all popular theories of second language acquisition since the 1970s have agreed with this idea. In general, they disagree about what happens in the brain after the comprehensible input, but they agree that it is necessary. Another important thing to add is that input needs to be comprehensible, but it also needs to be communicative. Remember the example of Hitomi earlier? Hitomi was surrounded by children and adults who wanted to communicate with her. She was not learning English from a teacher who only talked about grammar. For a language to be acquired, there needs to be communication in the classroom, and for communication to work, there needs to be a goal. That's why I teach with stories. Creating and telling stories serve a clear communicative purpose. Often, that goal is simply having fun. Other communicative goals include learning more about the students in class, discussing serious issues, and working on a project together. If you're learning on your own, you might believe that reading books and listening to podcasts isn't communication. But it is. My stories convey a message, and as you read them, you consider what they mean and whether you enjoy them. This is an important form of communication. The second hypothesis is the acquisition-learning hypothesis. I talked earlier about the difference between acquisition and learning. Basically, learning is a conscious process. Conscious means you know when you are doing it, and acquisition is a subconscious process. When something is subconscious, you don't realize it's happening. So, learning might be studying grammar rules, and acquisition might be understanding the meaning of the word ball by meeting it in lots of different contexts. The acquisition learning hypothesis states that we only improve our language skills through acquisition. Of course, this is controversial. When something is controversial, many people argue about whether it is true or not. Why is it controversial to say that we only improve our language skills through acquisition? Well, it depends on what you think language is. Is language a list of grammar rules and vocabulary like you see in textbooks? That is the traditional way of understanding language. And if you think language is just a list of rules, then it is better to teach the rules, even when you are using comprehensible input as well. But there is plenty of research that shows that language is a lot more abstract than this. When something is abstract, it means that it is not simple and clear. For example, abstract paintings can be very beautiful. But when you look at an abstract painting, it is usually very hard to tell what it is. Researchers such as Bill Van Patten say that the language we have inside our brains is very abstract. It's quite difficult to test abstract knowledge scientifically, but it is possible. I won't get into the details because it's quite complicated, but there are ways to test for subconscious knowledge of a language, and now we can even use machines that look at people's brains while they use language. In my own experience, I can usually tell when a student has mainly used conscious learning instead of subconscious acquisition. In the past, I've had students who learned through an app like Duolingo, which mainly uses conscious learning. Often, they didn't listen to what I said and understood very little. Then, when they wanted to speak, they looked in the air, said and spent a long time trying to find the right word. It was like their brain had put the words in a box of facts and not in the box of language. Stephen Krashen's third hypothesis is called the monitor hypothesis. The idea is to have a monitor that allows us to listen to and change our language use. For example, when you write a document, you use your monitor to check your grammar and spelling. When speaking in front of an audience, you use your monitor to ensure that you are saying the correct words. Essentially, the monitor is a little voice in our heads that helps us speak and write more effectively. According to the monitor hypothesis, consciously learned language can only be used to monitor our output, our speaking and writing, after we've already said or written it, whereas our subconsciously acquired language is responsible for the original speech and writing. Think of it this way. Maybe you find the present perfect tense hard in English. I know a lot of learners do. So, you study all the rules, learn how to make the tense, and what situations to use it in. But often, you say something and then only realize afterward that you should have used the present perfect tense. Or you know when to use the tense but form it incorrectly. These are examples of using your monitor. Until you get enough input in English, until you read and listen enough in English, you won't be able to naturally use the present perfect tense because you have only learned it, not acquired it. This idea is hard for many people to understand. What it means is that if there's one area of grammar that you find hard, you should not go and study the rules. Instead, you should keep reading and listening to things that are at the right level, the I-am level for you, and then you will acquire it without realizing it. When you learn a language in the classroom, there's a lot of focus on speaking and writing correctly, so you learn to have your monitor on all the time. For some students, this creates big problems. They find that they can never relax in a conversation. They're always worried about making mistakes. And so they have less energy to understand the person they're speaking to. So if you can, please turn off your monitor, find people who don't correct your grammar, and make you feel comfortable speaking. Stephen Krashen's fourth hypothesis is known as the natural order hypothesis. According to this theory, all learners progress through language acquisition in a predetermined sequence. What's intriguing is that this natural order of grammar acquisition doesn't always align with our expectations. Certain grammatical concepts, typically perceived as simple, may be learned later in the language learning process. For instance, in English, the addition of an S to verbs in the third-person singular present tense is a grammar point that is often grasped later than others. For example, we say I walk, but he walks. This is quite a strange rule because verbs don't change like this otherwise in English, and research shows that in first language acquisition and second language acquisition, this grammar point is acquired very late on. However, most teachers of English think this is a simple rule, so they spend lots of time teaching it and correcting students' mistakes at an early level. This wastes time and makes students feel bad for not understanding something simple when it's one of the last things native speakers acquire as well. If you approach language as a set of rigid rules, teaching in this manner appears logical. However, if you view language as abstract and nuanced, this approach may seem less sensible. Since Krashen first proposed his theory, subsequent research has confirmed the validity of this notion. It has been demonstrated that various aspects of language follow a natural order, supporting the idea that language acquisition is a dynamic and structured process. This is sometimes called ordered development. The order can change a bit depending on your native language, but it mostly stays the same. Lastly, Stephen Krashen's fifth hypothesis is known as the affective filter hypothesis. Here, affective, spelled with an A, pertains to emotions or feelings. A filter in this context is akin to a barrier that allows certain elements to pass through while blocking others. For example, you might use an air filter to keep some things in the air, like oxygen, which is very important for us to live, but to take out things like dead skin and pollen, which make the quality of the air worse. The affective filter hypothesis states that when a learner has negative emotions and bad feelings like anxiety, nervousness, or boredom, the negative emotions create a filter that makes acquiring language harder. If you're having fun while learning English and you feel relaxed, you're going to understand a lot more of the language. But if you are bored, hungry, or scared that you'll say something wrong, you'll understand less language. Those negative emotions create a filter that stops the language from coming in. As a result, it is critical for language classes and resources to elicit positive emotions. Correcting students for mistakes, in my experience, primarily produces negative emotions. Over time, students can develop a strong affective filter. I've had students who are so nervous that as soon as they don't understand a single word, they panic, become anxious, and then are unable to comprehend anything. So these are the 5 hypotheses that comprise Stephen Krashen's theory of comprehensible input. I'll just remind you what they are, and then we'll take a break. When we return, I'll explain how I use them to create content. The 5 hypotheses are: Number 1. The input hypothesis is that we acquire language best when it is just a bit above our current level, or I-highs +1. Number 2. The acquisition learning hypothesis is that subconsciously acquired language and consciously learned language are separate, and improvement comes only from acquisition. Number 3. The monitor hypothesis is that consciously learned language can only be used to monitor our output, our speaking and writing, and not to speak and write. Number 4. The natural order hypothesis is that all learners acquire language in a certain order. Number 5. The affective filter hypothesis is that negative emotions can create a filter that makes acquiring language harder. That was a lot, huh? Your brain must be hurting now. So let's take another break. You could even go and sleep for a bit, or come back to this episode another day. Don't worry, I'll still be here. But don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video. Thank you all.